The snow fell relentlessly over the small Bavarian village of Damerung, blanketed with crooked rooftops and cobbled streets in an ethereal white. It was Christmas Eve, and the villagers, cloistered in their homes, feigned cheer with their candles and songs. Beneath the warmth of their hearts, however, shadows lingered, and every creak in the floorboards felt like the approach of something far older than Christmas itself. The legend of Krampus had always been told in hushed tones during Advent. It was a cautionary tale meant to keep children obedient. Parents would whisper of the horned creature who punished the wicked, his cloven hooves marking trails through the snow. Yet as centuries passed, the legend faded into folklore, no longer feared but laughed at, until last year. The events of last Christmas were scarcely whispered about. 12 children vanished without a trace, their tiny footprints leading into a dense forest surrounding Damarang. No search parties returned. Some claimed to hear strange howls in the wind or on the wind, while others reported glimpses of a horned figure in the shadows. This year, however, the villagers dared not speak of it. To acknowledge the horror was to invite it back. Among the villagers, none were unnerved as the widow Greta. The previous year, her only daughter, Annalise, had been one of the 12. Greta's once vibrant face was now sunken, her hands trembling as she clutched her rosary. She had warned the others to forego their celebrations, to extinguish their lights, and hold no carols. He thrives on joy, she said. She had whispered to the baker on the mockery of holy days, but her warnings fell on deaf ears. That evening, as Greta stared into the flames of her dying hearth, a sound drifted through the howling wind, the low, haunting chime of bells. Her heart seized, for these were no merry bells. They carried a malevolence. Each toll resonated with dread. She peered out her frost-covered window and saw only the snow swirling in the dark. But Greta was not the only one to hear them. Across the village, children stirred in their beds, their eyes wide with fear. Claus, the blacksmith's son, bolted upright, clutching his blanket as a shadow passed under his door. In the church, Father Wilhelm prayed fervently, the candles flickering against the stained glass as the ancient fear clawed at his soul. In the forest beyond Damarang, something stirred. The villagers who dared venture near the tree line would later describe the scene as if the earth itself had split open. The snow was blackened and the air stank of sulfur. There, amidst the gnarled roots of ancient pines, he emerged. Krampus, the bringer of terror, stood tall on his goat-like legs, his muscular torso covered in coarse black fur, horns twisted skyward from his forehead, and his face was a grotesque blend of beast and man, with glowing, malevolent eyes. In one clawed hand, he gripped his staff, a gnarling branch adorned with runes that pulsed with an eerie light. In the other, he dragged chains and a sack of writhed as though alive. Krampus descended upon the village like a plague. His first victim was young Claus, whose cries echoed through the night as the beast smashed through the blacksmith's doors. The boy's parents could only watch in horror as the creature stuffed their son into his sack. The chains rattled ominously. They tried to fight, but the staff in Krampus's hands unleashed a wave of darkness, paralyzing them where they stood. The baker's family was next, their windows shattered as the beast clawed his way inside. The scent of gingerbread mixed with the iron tang of blood as Krampus claimed his second prize. Father Wilhelm, hearing the commotion, rang the church bells to summon the villagers. They gathered in the square, clutching torches and pitchforks, their faces pale with fear. But even as they stood together, a suffocating fog rolled in, silencing their courage. From the mist, the glow of Krampus's eyes pierced the darkness, and the villagers began to scatter. Among the fleeing villagers was Elias, the town historian. Unlike others, Elias had spent years studying forbidden texts locked away in the church's archives. He had read of Krampus's true origins, tracing him back not to Christian myth, but to something far older. Krampus, Elias believed, was no mere punisher of the wicked. He was a harbinger of chaos, a servant of the great old ones, the ancient gods whispered of in blasphemous tomes. Elias ran to Greta's house, pounding on her door. "Widow Greta," he gasped, "you were right. He thrives on our joy, our defiance. We must appease him." Greta opened the door, her face a mask of resignation. It is too late," she said, her voice hollow. "We mocked the old ways, and now we pay the price." As Elias tried to convince her to flee, the bells tolled again, louder this time. A shadow loomed behind him. Greta screamed as Krampus's claws closed around Elias, dragging him into the night. The villagers sought refuge in the church, huddled together as Father Wilhelm recited prayers, but the holy ground offered no sanctuary. The great doors were torn asunder as Krampus stepped into the sacred space. The stained glass shattered, the fragments cutting into flesh as the villagers scrambled to escape. Father Wilhelm stood his ground, raising a crucifix against the beast. "In the name of God, I command thee to..." Krampus silenced him with a swipe of his staff, sending the priest crashing to the altar. The crucifix fell, and the candles extinguished, leaving the church in darkness. By dawn, the village was silent. The snow was stained red, and the homes were empty. Krampus had claimed them all, his sack filled with the souls of the damned and the innocent alike. Greta, the last survivor, stood alone in the square. She watched as Krampus disappeared into the forest, the bells fading into the distance. With trembling hands, she lit a candle and placed it in the snow. "For Annalise," she whispered. The flame flickered, then extinguished, leaving her in darkness. And in the darkness, Greta heard the bells once more. In the years that followed, no one dared to rebuild Demerong. Travelers spoke of a cursed village where shadows moved without light and the wind carried the cries of children. Krampus became more than a legend. He was a warning. But even warnings are often forgotten. Far away in another village, the snow began to fall, and with it came the sound of bells. The desert had been calm, the land stretching endless under a blood-orange sun that dipped on the horizon, but the air was heavy, thick with a silence that felt unnatural. Then came the sounds of hooves, relentless, echoing in the void. El Muerto, the headless rider, tearing across the barren lands with a spectral fury. His black horse's eyes glowed a faint red, as if from within, and though he had no head, his presence radiated an unmistakably rage. Once feared in life as a bandit, now El Muerto was feared in death for the vengeance that kept him bound to this earth. His form moved like a shadow, half in this world and half beyond, eternally searching for the rest he would never find. He had once battled the living in the law, but now it was not the living he faced. It was something older, something that death could not conquer. He rode deep into what had once been the heart of an empire, land soaked in the blood of ancient rituals and steeped in the power of gods long forgotten. Unwittingly, his pursuit had led him to the ruins of an Aztec temple, a place where the dead did not sleep. The winds whispered, carrying with them the faint echoes of drums, the scent of blood that had long dried but never disappeared. Here beneath the ruins lay the restless spirits of warriors and priestesses who had once served gods whose names had been lost to time. But something stirred in the ruins that night, something far darker than any restless souls. The earth beneath the temple trembled, and from the depths of the underworld a figure rose. Meklalenti, the god of death, materialized from the shadows, his skeletal form towering above the temple ruins. His hollow eyes blazed with ancient rage, and with a silent command, the ground crackled open, releasing the undead from their eternal slumber. These were no ordinary spirits. These were the Aztec undead, warriors who had served the god of the dead in life and now served him in death. They emerged, bones clattering, their hollow sockets glowing with the fire of forgotten wars. And at their helm, Meklalenti raised his skeletal hand, calling forth the wrath of the underworld itself. The clash was immediate and violent. El Muerto swung his blackened sword, a blade dulled by the countless souls it had once reaped in life. The undead warriors advanced, their skeletal limbs clattering but moving with unnatural speed, wielding obsidian blades that gleamed even in the dim light of the underworld's veil. His sword struck one down, but it rose again as though untouched. Another grabbed the reins of his horse, pulling him to the ground, while a priestess with the face of death itself hissed her ancient curse, her voice echoing with the force of 1,000 souls. For the first time in his cursed afterlife, El Muerto felt something akin to fear. The warriors, unlike the lawmen who had once killed him, knew no restraint. The gods of death and the sun had abandoned them to endless war, their existence a cycle of battle that could not be stopped by mere mortal will. His rage and vengeance, though mighty, were no match for the ancient powers they wielded. Yet El Muerto had never known surrender, not even in death. He rose, tearing free from the grasp of the undead, and mounted his horse once more. But as he did, Mechlente descended from the shadows, his skeletal wings spreading wide as he prepared to meet the rider in a battle that would shake the very foundations of the underworld. The battle between El Muerto and Mechlente began with a storm of fury. The god of death swung his obsidian claw with unimaginable force, each striking, splitting the earth beneath them. El Muerto countered with each strike, with his sword blackened by the deaths it had caused in life. But even his blade seemed to falter against the overwhelming power of Mechlente. The two forces clashed with the sound of thunder, their blows sending shockwaves through the ruins. The god of death does not bow to mortals, a voice seemed to echo through the battlefield, though Mechlente's skeletal face remained emotionless. He summoned the winds of the underworld, the souls of the dead swirling around him, rising from the earth in a storm of bones and spirits. El Muerto found himself surrounded on all sides, the undead closing in, their skeletal forms relentless and merciless. Yet in the face of this, El Muerto did not retreat. His sword flashed again and again, carving through the dead as he charged directly towards Mechlente, seeking the heart of the battle. His rage was now not just for survival, but for dominance over death itself, an impossible task, but one that drove him forward. The two forces collided in a terrible storm of violence. Mechlente summoned creatures from the depths of Mictlan, spectral beasts with gaping jaws, their forms twisting and writhing as they tore through the air toward El Muerto. But the headless rider was swift, his horse galloping through the chaos, cutting through the beast with a precision that defied the odds. His blade met Mechlente's obsidian claw once more, sparks flying as they clashed. The god of death let out a roar, the sound splitting the sky as his hand closed around the blade, shattering it to pieces. El Muerto was thrown back by the force, his sword destroyed, and yet still he rose. The god of death, now towering above him, summoned all the powers of the underworld. The ground beneath them trembled as if the earth itself was ready to swallow them whole. Realizing that his battle against the god of death was futile, El Muerto tore away from the ruins, mounting his horse with a desperate fury. He rode hard, fast, leaving behind the temple, but the undead followed. They pursued with a relentless hunger, their skeletal hands grasping at the shadows, their forms blurring into the earth itself, as they merged with the land, rising again and again whenever El Muerto tried to flee. Mechlente's vengeance was endless, and his undead army chased El Muerto wherever he rode, leaving destruction in their wake. Villages once peaceful were ravaged, their people slaughtered as the undead tore through them in pursuit of the rider. Each time El Muerto thought he had escaped, the undead would rise from the earth, driven by the will of their god to hunt him down. In his desperation, El Muerto pushed his horse harder, trying to outrun the ancient curse that clung to him. But no matter where he rode, the undead followed, their skeletal hands reaching for him, their hollow eyes glowing with the fire of vengeance. The pursuit was endless, and for the first time, El Muerto felt the weight of defeat pressing down on him. The final confrontation came as El Muerto reached a great chasm in the earth, a place where the desert ended and the world seemed to drop off into the abyss. Behind him, the undead warriors gathered once again, their skeletal forms glistening in the moonlight as they advanced. And there, on the other side of the chasm, stood Mechalente, his wings spread wide as he called for the rider's surrender. But El Muerto did not stop. Instead, he spurred his horse forward, galloping towards the edge of the cliff, the skeletal warriors close behind. The undead reached out, their hands grasping for the reins of his horse, but with a final leap, the horse and rider plunged into the abyss. The wind howled as they fell, the world spinning around them, the undead screeching as they followed, but it was not the end. Far below, in the depths of the abyss, a different power stirred, something older than Mechalente, something deeper than the underworld's reach. And as El Muerto fell into the darkness, he vanished, leaving only the god of death and his undead army to stare into the endless void, their vengeance unfulfilled. But the pursuit never ended. Even in the depths of the abyss, the Aztec undead followed, for death was a cycle that could never be broken. As long as El Muerto existed, so too would the forces of the underworld, chasing him through the realms of the living and the dead, locked in an eternal dance of vengeance, fear, and fury.